It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a much-needed escape from the chaos of everyday life. Sarah, Mark, Alice, Tom, and Danny had been planning the trip for months. They were all friends from college, and after a year of hectic work schedules and the constant buzz of city life, they were finally going to take a break. The plan was simple: leave behind the noise, the traffic, and the constant rush. They had rented a remote cabin in the heart of Canada's frozen wilderness, far from the nearest town and nestled near the infamous Kootenay National Park. The excitement was high as the five friends piled into Mark's SUV, all eager for the adventure ahead. The mountain road was long and winding, with tall trees towering above them on both sides. The snow, pure and untouched, blanketed the landscape as far as the eye could see, creating a serene and almost magical setting. It was the perfect winter retreat, peaceful, secluded, and free of distractions. Sarah sat in the front seat, her eyes glued to the window as the snow-covered trees seemed to pass by in a blur. She couldn't help but marvel at how beautiful the world looked from this remote, snow-covered world. It was nothing like the bustling city streets they had left behind. The world here seemed slower, quieter, and more calm. "We're almost there," Mark, the driver, called out from the front, his voice tinged with excitement. He had taken the wheel for the trip, eager to explore the hidden gems of Canada's wilderness. Alice, sitting next to Sarah, leaned forward, her nose pressed against the window. "I can't wait to get there. I heard the cabin is beautiful. Just imagine the cozy nights by the fire. No Wi-Fi, just us and nature." Tom and Danny, in the back, were laughing and joking as usual, playfully teasing each other. "Better make sure you don't get lost out there, Danny," Tom teased, nudging his friend. "I'm not the one who gets lost," Danny shot back with a grin. "I'm the one who finds adventure." Sarah smiled at their banter, but something inside her felt uneasy. It wasn't that she didn't want to be here. She did. She just had this nagging feeling in the back of her mind. A feeling she couldn't shake. It was as if something was watching them. Something far beyond the peaceful silence of the snowy woods. It was an odd thought, but it was there, gnawing at the back of her mind. As the drive continued, Sarah glanced at the GPS on her phone. The signal was growing weaker with each passing mile, but that wasn't unusual for a remote location like this. Still, she couldn't help but notice that the deeper they went into the mountains, the more everything around them seemed to quiet down. The trees, which had been so lively earlier, now stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow. There was no chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire forest had been swallowed by the snow, leaving behind only a vast emptiness. "Hey, guys, do you think we're going the right way?" Sarah asked, her voice slightly hesitant. She looked down at her phone, the GPS showing only a faint signal now. Mark glanced over at her briefly, a playful smirk on his face. "It's fine. We're almost there. It's just the mountain range messing with the signal. It'll clear up soon." Sarah nodded, but something still felt off. She had heard that the Kootenay National Park was known for its isolated beauty, but she hadn't realized just how secluded it really was. They hadn't passed another car for miles, and the only sounds they heard were the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of tires on the snow. It was beautiful, yes, but also strangely desolate. She turned her attention to the outside world again, watching the snowflakes dance in the wind. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but the longer they were on the road, the more Sarah felt a rising sense of dread. It wasn't that she thought something bad was going to happen, nothing specific, but she just couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something unknown. "Maybe we should check the map one more time," Sarah said, glancing at the others. Her voice was casual, but she could hear the uncertainty in her own tone. Mark chuckled, reaching over to adjust the rear-view mirror. "Sarah, you worry too much. The cabin's just up ahead. We're fine." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just headed to a cozy little cabin for the weekend. No, it felt like they were heading into something much darker, something that had been waiting for them. Just then, the radio crackled and died, plunging the car into an eerie silence. Mark tapped the dial, but the static didn't clear. "Great," he muttered. "No music, no signal, just us and the wilderness." "Perfect," Alice chimed in. "It's like a horror movie. You know, the one where people get stuck in the middle of nowhere, and then bad things happen." Tom laughed nervously. "Okay, that's enough of that. Let's not jinx ourselves. We're just going to a cabin, remember? Nothing spooky about it." Even as he said it, Sarah noticed the nervous glances exchanged between them. They were all feeling it now. The strange unease that had been creeping up on her since they first turned onto the mountain road. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling against the SUV. The snow began to swirl around them, obscuring their view of the road. The further they went, the harder it became to see anything outside the windows. The world seemed to be disappearing into a blinding white void. It was beautiful, but it felt like they were being swallowed by the storm. "Mark, are we sure we're on the right road?" Sarah asked again, her voice tight with anxiety. "Yeah, we're fine," Mark said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. He squinted through the windshield, trying to peer through the storm, but all he could see was a blur of white. "It's just the storm. We're almost there. Dot." They pressed on, the snowstorm growing fiercer with every passing minute. The trees around them seemed to fade into the background, disappearing into the white haze. Sarah felt a sense of isolation creeping in. It wasn't just the storm that made her feel this way. It was the feeling that they were being cut off from everything. The world they knew, the world of cities and people, was a distant memory. Here, in the heart of the wilderness, they were alone. But then, through the thick snow, something appeared in the distance, a faint shadow, standing out against the whiteness of the snow. It was just a silhouette at first, but as they got closer, Sarah could make out the shape of a large structure ahead. The cabin. "We made it," Mark said, his voice relieved. The friends exchanged relieved glances. The tension that had built up during the drive starting to ease. They had reached their destination. Little did they know they weren't just entering a remote cabin for a weekend retreat. They were about to step into a nightmare that had been waiting for them. Hidden in the heart of Canada's wilderness, the snowstorm raged on outside and the wind howled through the trees. But inside the cabin, the group of friends settled in, unaware that the true terror was only just beginning. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the first thing they noticed was how eerily quiet it was. The SUV crunched to a stop in front of the rustic building, and as the engine's hum faded, the silence enveloped them. No rustling of leaves in the wind, no chirping of birds, nothing. Just absolute stillness. The cabin stood alone against the backdrop of towering trees, its wooden exterior almost blending into the snow-covered landscape. It was isolated, with no other houses or signs of life in sight for miles. A kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Wow, this place is way more remote than I thought, Alice said, looking out of the window. She sounded a little unsettled, but her eyes were wide with curiosity. I mean, it's like we're the only ones left on Earth. I know, right? Mark agreed, glancing at Sarah. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? No distractions, just us and the woods. The rest of the group was still silent, processing the isolation around them. The trees stood like silent sentinels, heavy with snow, their branches stiff and unmoving. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed up by the snowstorm they had just passed through. Even the mountains seemed to be shrouded in a strange, heavy fog. All right, let's get inside, Alice suggested, breaking the tension. Her voice was louder than usual, a clear attempt to push away the discomfort that had begun creeping in. She fumbled with the door handle, and the cold air rushed in as soon as she stepped out, causing her to shiver immediately. This cold is brutal, Alice muttered, rubbing her arms to warm herself up. Mark followed suit, making sure to grab the bags from the back seat. Sarah hesitated for a moment, taking one last glance at the empty wilderness. Something about it didn't feel right, but she quickly dismissed it, deciding she was just being paranoid after the long drive. They had made it, and this would be their home for the weekend. Stepping inside the cabin felt like entering another world. The air was warm and smelled faintly of wood and pine. A crackling fire in the stone fireplace lit up the living room, casting flickering shadows against the walls. It was cozy, almost too cozy, the kind of warmth that wrapped around you like a blanket, inviting you to settle in and relax. The walls were lined with rustic furniture, leather chairs, a long wooden table in the center of the room, and bookshelves filled with old novels. There was something charming about it, like it had been carefully decorated to feel like a home away from home. "This is perfect," Mark said, smiling as he set down their bags. "I could get used to this." "I love it," Alice added, her eyes scanning the room. "It's so quaint and peaceful." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Something about the place felt off. The silence was too deep, the stillness too absolute. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the air seemed thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the cold from outside. It was something else, something that pressed against her chest as she stood there. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Well, it's a little too quiet for my taste," Tom joked, breaking her concentration. "I mean, are we sure this isn't one of those creepy horror movie cabins?" The others laughed, but Sarah couldn't help but glance at the window again, feeling the weight of the stillness press in around her. She shook her head, blaming it on the long journey and the weird feeling. But Tom only grinned. "I'm just saying, it's the kind of place where they'd make one of those slasher films, right? Is there an axe murderer hiding under the floorboards?" The group laughed at that, and for a moment, the tension seemed to lift. They started to unpack and settle in, putting their things in the bedrooms and making themselves comfortable. As Sarah took a moment to collect her thoughts, she found herself staring at the large stone fireplace, watching the flames dance. She tried to force the unsettling feeling away, but it lingered in the back of her mind. After a while, they all gathered back in the living room, deciding to make the most of their first night in the cabin. The conversation flowed easily. Stories of college days, jokes, and lighthearted teasing. But Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the silence outside, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. It was then that Tom noticed something strange on the wall. He stood up from the couch, his eyes narrowing as he walked over to a large framed map that hung by the fireplace. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to a spot on the map. It was a detailed topographical map of the area. But what caught his attention was a red circle drawn around a particular spot deep in the forest, far from the trails that were marked on the map. The others looked over, and for a moment, no one spoke. The red circle seemed oddly out of place, a stark contrast to the otherwise unmarked areas on the map. It felt deliberate, like someone had specifically marked this spot. "What is that?" Alice asked, moving closer to Tom. "A hiking trail?" Tom frowned, tracing the circle with his finger. "I don't think so. It's way off the beaten path." Danny, who had been rummaging through a nearby drawer, looked over at the map. "It's probably just a local hiking spot. A place people go to, explore. Look, it's not even on the main map. So it could just be something some hikers marked out." "But why circle it in red?" Sarah said quietly, her unease growing. "It looks more like a warning." Danny gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't overthink it, Sarah. It's probably nothing. I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere, right? There are bound to be some strange places out here." Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That spot on the map, it called to her in a way that she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the isolation that unsettled her. It was the idea of the unknown, of what lay hidden in the woods, beyond the snow-covered trees. "Well, tomorrow we'll probably want to check out the nearby trails," Danny continued, turning back to the map. "That one's probably too far out, but we could head over to a few others tomorrow if you want." Sarah nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. Maybe we should just stick to the safer trails, the ones that are closer to the cabin. "Sarah's right," Mark said, glancing at her. "Let's not get too adventurous on the first day. We're here to relax, not get lost in the woods." "Yeah, but it could be fun," Tom said with a shrug. "I mean, if we're here to really get away from it all, why not explore? Worst case scenario, we just get a little lost, right?" But Sarah wasn't convinced. The longer she stared at the map, the more she felt an irrational pull toward that red circle, a place marked for some unknown reason. The thought of going there made her skin crawl, but she didn't want to ruin the mood for everyone else. "I guess we'll see tomorrow," she said quietly, forcing a smile. That night, as they sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing, Sarah's mind kept returning to the map. She tried to push it out of her thoughts, but it was like a nagging itch she couldn't scratch. The forest beyond the cabin, the silence that surrounded it, the strange marking on the map. It all seemed too strange, too disconnected. It felt like something was watching them, something waiting. She wasn't sure what, but she had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't something they should be messing with. That night, as the group settled in for bed, the wind outside began to pick up. It started as a subtle gust, but soon it transformed into a fierce howl that whipped against the cabin's wooden walls, like a pack of wolves baying at the moon. The sound was unnerving, deep and relentless, making the old logs creak and groan under the pressure. Inside, the fire still crackled, but the warmth it provided seemed to pale in comparison to the growing chill that seeped into the house from every corner. They had all been enjoying the evening, cards, drinks, and light-hearted conversation, before the storm came out of nowhere. Sarah had been half listening to the others, her thoughts drifting back to the strange feeling she'd had earlier. But now, as the storm intensified, the atmosphere had shifted. The cabin, once a welcoming refuge, now felt like a trap. Isolated in the middle of nowhere, with no escape from the dark forces raging outside. The lights flickered once, then twice, before they went out completely, leaving them in complete darkness. For a moment, there was only the eerie glow of the fireplace, casting long shadows across the room, making the furniture seem to stretch and contort into unsettling shapes. "Great. We're stuck with no lights," Alice said, trying to sound cheerful, but her voice trembled slightly as the reality of their situation set in. She stood up, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "This is great. Totally what I needed." "Don't worry, I've got flashlights," Mark said with a grin, though there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping it around the room. The light wasn't much, but it was enough to make the dark corners of the cabin feel just a little less intimidating. The group gathered in the living room, sitting close to the fire for warmth. They tried to keep their spirits up, laughing and joking about how they were living the true wilderness experience. Mark had brought along some whiskey, and the group began passing the bottle around. Tom was cracking jokes, trying to lighten the mood, But Sarah couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that was growing inside her. The wind howled louder outside, its banshee wail scratching at the walls of the cabin, and something about the storm didn't sit right with her. It was too loud, too fierce, almost as if the storm itself was alive and angry. "Okay, enough of this," Tom said after a while, tossing down his cards. "We need a change of pace. Let's play something else. How about some charades?" "I'm not in the mood for that," Alice said, her voice a little sharper than usual. She was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes darting nervously between the window and the others. "What's up with this storm, though? It feels different, you know?" Mark laughed lightly, though it was forced. "Come on, you're acting like it's a hurricane. It's just snow. It'll pass." But Alice wasn't convinced. "It's not just the snow. It's the sound. It's too much. It's like the storm is alive." The others tried to brush off her concerns, focusing instead on the fire and the low hum of the wind outside. But Sarah noticed something different. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else, something deeper, more insistent. It almost felt as if the storm itself was trying to make its presence known, to send them a warning. And then, just as the conversation lulled into a quiet moment, it came. A noise, faint at first, barely audible over the howl of the storm. But it was there, unmistakable. A sharp, chilling scream, filled with pain and desperation. It pierced the air, cutting through the wind like a knife. "Did you guys hear that?" Danny's voice was tight, his eyes wide as he looked around at the others. He was sitting on the floor, his legs crossed, and his face was pale. His expression was no longer playful. It was one of genuine fear. "Hear what?" Tom replied, looking confused. "It's just the wind. You're imagining things." "No, seriously," Danny insisted, his voice shaking slightly. It sounded like someone was screaming. Far off, but clear. It was like someone's in pain. Group fell silent, straining to listen. But the wind drowned out everything else. Its howling, a constant roar that filled the room. Sarah could feel her pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out along the back of her neck. She had heard it too, but she didn't want to admit it. The scream, sharp, mournful, and so filled with anguish, was unlike anything she'd ever heard. It wasn't just the wind. There was something more to it. Something human, desperate. "Stop messing around, Danny," Mark said, forcing a laugh as he shook his head. "It's just the storm. Trust me, I've been out in worse." Tom chimed in, clearly trying to dismiss the unease that had settled over them. "Yeah, it's just your imagination. The wind can make all kinds of weird noises out here." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The scream still echoed in her ears, like an imprint in her mind. It wasn't the wind. It couldn't be. The scream had been too real, too full of emotion, and it wasn't like anything she had ever heard before. The others were trying to play it off, but Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that was spreading through her chest, the icy fear creeping into her bones. She had heard the stories, the ones about the Snowbound Scream. Local legends whispered. Sarah shook her head, her eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of the room. No, that wasn't any animal. That was something else. Danny stood up quickly, his face pale. I'm going outside to check, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his nerves. Maybe we've got some wild animals nearby. I'll just take a look. Are you insane? Mark said, grabbing Danny's arm. It's a freaking blizzard out there. You're not going anywhere. The wind's too strong, and it's freezing out there. But Danny shook off Mark's grip. I'll be fine. I'll just take a quick look. You guys stay here. I'll be right back. Before anyone could stop him, Danny had grabbed a flashlight and was heading toward the door, his silhouette disappearing into the blinding snowstorm. The door slammed behind him, and for a moment, all they could hear was the wind, now even louder than before, howling as if in protest. The others looked at each other, unease spreading across their faces. I don't like this, Alice whispered, her voice trembling slightly. This feels wrong. Sarah nodded, her stomach twisting with dread. The scream, Danny's impulsive decision to go outside, everything about the situation felt off. She had hoped the scream was just a figment of her imagination, but now, with Danny out there, she wasn't so sure. Minutes passed in silence, the storm outside growing more intense by the second. The door hadn't opened again, and the only sounds were the relentless wind and the crackling of the fire. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting just outside the door. Something that had already set its sights on them. The scream. It was a warning. But a warning about what? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Danny stumbled back inside, his face pale and covered with snow. His eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in sharp gasps. I couldn't find anything, he said, his voice strained. There's nothing out there. No animals, no people, just the storm. The group stared at him, their hearts pounding in their chests. The scream was still ringing in Sarah's ears, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done with them yet. They were trapped in this cabin, surrounded by the storm, and something was waiting. Something had already claimed the night as its own. And the worst part was, they hadn't even begun to understand the true nature of the nightmare that was unfolding around them. The next day, the storm was still raging. The wind howled through the trees, whipping up the snow in a chaotic swirl that blocked out the sunlight. The snow drifts were deep, and the landscape outside the cabin had turned into a ghostly white wasteland. For hours, the group had been cooped up in the cabin, restlessly pacing the rooms, trying to pass the time with whatever games they could find. It was clear that they couldn't stay locked in for long. The storm was showing no signs of letting up, and the walls of the cabin, once a cozy refuge, were beginning to feel like a cage. They needed to get out, if only to stretch their legs and breathe some fresh air. After much deliberation, They finally agreed to venture out despite the still strong winds. They bundled up in their snow gear, thick coats, scarves, and boots, and stepped out into the relentless storm. It was like walking into a frozen world. The wind stung their faces, and the snow came down so thick that it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Yet, there was something oddly compelling about the wilderness. The forest, with its towering trees and endless stretches of white, seemed to beckon them. It was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the roar of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. They walked deeper into the woods, their steps muffled by the thick snow that had been falling for hours. With every step, the world around them grew even more silent, as if the forest itself had gone to sleep. The trees loomed tall over them, their thick branches hanging low with the weight of the snow, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and stretch with the wind. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she couldn't explain why. It was just that uncanny, prickling sensation on the back of her neck that had been gnawing at her since the moment they'd arrived at the cabin. "Feels like we're walking through a ghost story," Alice said, her voice barely rising above the wind. She looked around at the trees, her breath coming out in little white puffs. "I mean, it's beautiful, but also kind of wrong." "Yeah," Tom said, trying to lighten the mood, "but at least we're not stuck inside." That storm was starting to feel like a prison. But no matter how much they tried to joke and laugh, the silence of the forest had a strange weight to it. The stillness felt unnatural, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they walked further into the woods, the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, like a blanket that was slowly smothering the world. There was no sign of wildlife, no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was as though all life had fled from the area, leaving behind only the silent trees and the snow-covered ground. The unsettling feeling that had been creeping up on Sarah only intensified with each step. She glanced at her friends, but none of them seemed to notice the eerie absence of sound. It was like they were all too focused on escaping the confinement of the cabin to notice the strange atmosphere pressing down on them. Then it came again, a faint scream, so distant at first that it was barely audible over the wind. But this time it was different. The scream wasn't carried on the wind. It felt real, close, like it was coming from somewhere in the forest. Sarah froze in place, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to look at Alice, whose face had gone pale. "Did you hear that?" Alice whispered, her voice tight with fear. It's like someone screaming." The others had heard it too, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. The forest was so quiet, so still, and yet there it was, the unmistakable sound of someone in distress, the cry of a person in pain. The scream echoed through the trees, cutting through the wind like a knife. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence that followed felt deafening, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Let's go back. I don't like this. It's not safe." Her heart was racing now, and she could feel a cold sweat creeping down her back despite the bitter chill in the air. She had heard stories, whispers really, about a curse that haunted these woods. The Snowbound Scream, they called it. An ancient spirit that wandered the forest, wailing for those who dared to venture too far. She didn't believe in such things, of course. It was just a legend, a story meant to scare people. But in that moment, standing in the heart of the forest with the wind howling around them and that scream still ringing in her ears, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that was settling deep inside her. "Let's just go back," Sarah repeated, her voice more urgent now. "We're not supposed to be out here." But before they could turn around, something caught Sarah's eye. A figure moving in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow against the thick snow, but as it moved closer, it became clearer. It was a woman, her figure slender and ghostly pale, dressed in tattered clothes. Her hair hung around her face in wild, tangled strands, and her skin was as white as the snow that surrounded her. She was standing in the clearing ahead, staring directly at them with wide, terror-stricken eyes. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman was floating. Her feet didn't touch the ground, and she moved as though she were being pulled by some invisible force. She hovered in the snow, her movements erratic and unnatural. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Sarah's, and a chill went through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The woman let out a deafening scream, her voice raw and filled with agony. "Get out of here," she shouted, her words almost lost in the wind. "The curse will take you all." Sarah's heart raced in her chest as the woman's voice echoed through the trees. It was a scream of pure terror, a cry for help that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The woman's face twisted in pain, her expression contorted with desperation. And before anyone could react, she turned and disappeared into the forest, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. The group stood frozen in place, too terrified to speak. The snow seemed to fall in slow motion, the world around them suddenly feeling distant, as though they were trapped in some nightmare they couldn't escape. The wind howled louder, and the trees seemed to shift and sway with an unnatural energy, their branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the storm. Tom was the first to break the silence. "Okay, we need to leave, now." His voice was shaky, but his words were firm. He turned, his boots crunching in the snow, and began to walk back toward the cabin. "No, wait," Danny said, his voice barely audible. "What just happened? Who was that?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her legs trembling as she followed the others. "But I don't think we're alone out here. Whatever it wasn't human." They walked quickly, their footsteps growing more frantic with every passing second. The forest seemed to press in around them, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Sarah could feel her pulse racing, the terror of the encounter still gripping her heart. They had all heard the stories about the Snowbound Scream, about the curse that haunted these woods, but none of them had ever truly believed it. Not until now. They didn't speak again as they made their way back to the cabin, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. The air was thick with fear, and even the wind seemed to have quieted as they hurried back to the safety of the cabin. When they finally reached the door, Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed it shut behind her and locked it with trembling hands. But even as they stood inside, the fear didn't fade. The screams still echoed in Sarah's mind. And the image of the woman, the terror in her eyes, haunted her every thought. They had come here looking for an escape, but now they were trapped. And whatever was out there in the forest, it was far from done with them. Back at the cabin, the group locked themselves inside, the heavy silence settling around them like a thick fog. The wind outside howled louder than ever, rattling the windows as if it were trying to force its way inside. They all stood in the living room, the fire still crackling in the hearth, but its warmth seemed to do little to ease the cold that had settled deep in their bones. Sarah could barely hold herself together. She was shaking, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. Her mind was racing with thoughts she couldn't control. Thoughts of the woman in the woods, of the scream that had pierced the air like a knife, and of the curse she knew they had just encountered. The stories weren't just stories. They were real. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse. We're trapped here." The others were standing in stunned silence, too afraid to speak, too shocked to process what had just happened. They all saw the same thing, didn't they? The woman in the snow, her face pale as death, her body floating above the ground. Her scream was unlike anything any of them had ever heard before, filled with raw, unbearable pain. But Sarah could feel it in her gut. She knew what they had just witnessed, the Snowbound Scream. She whispered, again, as if saying it aloud would make it all real. Mark scoffed, but Sarah could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way his hand twitched as if reaching for something to steady himself. "Come on, Sarah. It was just a person. Maybe some local who got caught in the storm or something. We're all just spooked from the weather." But even Mark couldn't hide the way his eyes darted to the door, the way his body was tense, ready to bolt. No one believed his words. They had all heard the stories. The same stories Sarah had dismissed as nothing more than folklore before this moment. But now, standing in the cabin with the storm raging outside, those stories seemed like the only truth they had. The Snowbound Scream, the legend that haunted these woods, was more than just a tale to frighten the locals. It was real. And it wasn't just some ghost roaming the woods. It was something far darker. A curse that had lasted for generations. The Snowbound Scream is the ghost of a woman who lost her family in a brutal winter storm, Sarah said, her voice low but filled with certainty. She was caught out in the storm, along with her husband and children. They were lost in the snow, freezing to death, unable to find shelter or warmth. And when she died, her spirit was cursed to wander these woods for eternity, crying out in pain for her lost family. They say her scream can be heard whenever the storm is at its worst. It's not just a sound, it's a warning. Anyone who hears it, they're marked. They'll never leave. The room went cold, colder than it had been a moment ago. The fire in the hearth seemed to flicker, casting long shadows across the walls, stretching like dark fingers reaching out to touch them. Alice shivered and hugged her arms to herself. "You've got to be kidding," she said, but her voice cracked. "You can't be serious." "I'm serious," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the panic that threatened to overtake her. "I've heard the stories. Locals talk about it all the time, but no one ever believes it. I didn't believe it either, but we just saw it. We just saw the Snowbound Scream. That woman, she was real." Tom looked around the cabin, his gaze flickering nervously to the windows, as if expecting something to jump out at him from the storm. "So what now? What do we do? How do we get out of here?" Sarah's mind raced as she thought back to the stories she had heard, the ones that whispered about the curse and the people who had vanished after hearing the scream. The legends were vague, unclear about what happened to those who became marked by the scream. Some said they disappeared, never to be seen again. Others said they became trapped in the woods, forever lost. No one knew for sure, because no one ever made it out once they heard the scream. "We can't leave," she said quietly. "We're trapped here. The curse has already taken us." "What?" Mark shot back, his voice rising in disbelief. "That's insane. There's no such thing as curses. We just need to wait out the storm, and we'll be fine. We'll leave once the snow clears up." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's not that simple. The scream, it marks you. Once you hear it, you're already a part of it. That woman, she wasn't just calling out for help. She was warning us. And the curse doesn't stop with a warning. It takes you." "Stop talking like that," Alice snapped, her voice shaking. She was looking at Sarah as though she had lost her mind. "This isn't real. We're just scared, that's all. It's just the storm messing with us. We're all tired and freaked out, but we're okay. We're all okay." "I wish I could believe that," Sarah whispered, "but I don't think we are." There was a long pause as the group absorbed Sarah's words. The wind outside had picked up again, howling and moaning as though it were alive. The sound was deafening, the kind of noise that made you feel like you were being suffocated by the storm. The fire in the hearth crackled, its light dancing across the room, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread that was taking root in Sarah's heart. "What are we supposed to do now?" Danny asked, his voice a little less certain than usual. "We can't just stay here forever." Sarah's mind was racing, but she knew what she had to say next. The legends didn't offer much in the way of hope, but there were whispers of one way to escape the curse, one way to break free of the Snowbound Scream. "There's a ritual," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "a way to end the curse, but no one's ever tried it. It's dangerous, and no one who's tried has ever come back to tell the tale. But it's the only way. ... Mark's eyes widened. "What ritual? What are you talking about?" "It's a ritual to appease the spirit," Sarah said, her words coming quickly now. You have to give something of yourself, something that means everything to you. It's supposed to placate the spirit, to make it stop haunting you. But no one knows exactly how it works. The stories say that people who've tried it, they've either failed or disappeared. What exactly do you mean by giving something of yourself? Tom asked, his voice uneasy. I don't know, Sarah admitted, her heart pounding. The stories are vague. They just say that you need to make a sacrifice, something of great value. The group stared at her, their faces pale in the firelight. The storm outside seemed to press closer, its winds howling like a living thing, as if it were closing in on them. Sarah's mind was still racing with the possibilities, with the overwhelming dread that seemed to weigh on her chest. Then what? Alice asked quietly, her voice small in the midst of the chaos outside. What happens if we don't do this ritual? Sarah looked up at her friends, her heart sinking. If we don't, we're stuck here. Forever. The curse doesn't let go. It keeps you trapped, wandering these woods, forever lost. The silence that followed felt like a suffocating weight. No one spoke. No one moved. The storm outside had taken on a life of its own, howling in fury. But inside, they were trapped in their own fear. They had ignored the warnings. They had ventured too far into the wilderness, and now it seemed like there was no escape. They were paying the price for their curiosity, for thinking they could escape the world and find solace in isolation. But they had unknowingly stepped into something much darker. And now, they had to face the consequences of their actions. The Snowbound Scream was... The question was, would they survive long enough to break it? Or would they become yet another chapter in the terrifying legend that haunted these woods? As night fell once again, the storm only grew fiercer. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the sound of something far more terrifying than a mere blizzard. It was the woman's scream, louder now, more intense, filled with unimaginable agony. It reverberated through the cabin, like the wailing of a tormented soul. The once gentle snowstorm had transformed into a wild, thrashing beast. The wind seemed to come from every direction, clawing at the walls, shaking the very foundation of the cabin, as if it were being assaulted by some invisible force. Inside, the group huddled together in the living room, their nerves fraying with every passing minute. The fire in the hearth struggling to stay alive, the flames flickering weakly as the cold began to creep in. They had already barricaded the windows and doors, using whatever furniture they could find to reinforce the cabin's defenses. But despite their best efforts, the storm and the scream outside had left them with a palpable sense of dread, one that neither the warmth, fire, nor their bravado could dispel. "We're not safe here," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Her mind raced with the terrible possibilities. The curse, the woman, the scream. It was all real, and they were in the eye of it now. There was no escape. Mark paced the floor, trying to calm himself. "We're fine. We've got everything locked up. The doors reinforced. Nothing's getting in here." But even as he said it, the door shook violently, the wood creaking and groaning under the strain of the wind. It was a sound that made their blood run cold, as though the very structure of the cabin was being tested, as if something was pushing against it from the outside, trying to get in. "I don't know, man," Danny muttered from his spot near the window. He was staring out into the blizzard, his face pale. "I don't think we're as safe as we think we are." Before anyone could respond, a knock echoed through the cabin, a single, sharp sound that cut through the tumultuous noise of the storm. It wasn't a random knock, but a deliberate one, firm and insistent. The group fell silent, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Tom, who had been trying to hold it together, swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and his voice came out shakier than he intended. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt, but the words didn't come out as strongly as he hoped. They trembled, betraying the fear that was gnawing at his insides. There was no answer, just the storm, the howl of the wind, and the eerily quiet knocking, which continued in steady intervals. Mark glanced at the others, his eyes wide with fear now. "Did anyone hear that?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We all heard it, but it's not possible. It can't be." Her heart was pounding in her chest as she stood up slowly, her legs feeling like lead. Every instinct told her to stay back, to keep herself as far from that door as possible. But her feet moved against her will, as if drawn by some unseen force. She approached the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps, each step more hesitant than the last. As she reached for the handle, a gust of cold wind rushed through the cracks in the cabin, nearly knocking her off her feet. It was icy, biting, and suffocating. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly, and for a moment, she thought she could feel the coldness of the woman's spirit creeping into her very bones. Sarah hesitated, her hand trembling as it hovered over the door handle. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to open it. She had to face whatever was on the other side. She gripped the handle, her fingers numb with fear, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open on its own, the hinges protesting with a loud squeal, as though they too were afraid of what was about to happen. Sarah stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest as the door swung wide. And there, standing in the doorway, was the woman. She was no longer just a ghostly figure lost in the forest. Now, she was here, in the cabin with them. Her pale face glowed in the dim light from the fireplace, her eyes as black as coal, like two hollow pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. Her mouth was twisted into a silent scream, her lips parted in an eternal wail of pain and anguish that no human voice could ever produce. The woman's long, tattered dress hung in tatters from her frame, the fabric billowing in the wind that poured in from outside. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, as if the very life had been drained from her body long ago. She floated in the doorway, her feet not touching the ground. She was neither standing nor kneeling. It was as though gravity had no hold on her. Her presence was suffocating, filling the space with an oppressive, unnatural force. Sarah took an instinctive step back, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. She couldn't move. The woman's eyes locked onto Sarah, and in that moment, time seemed to slow. Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze, the terror in those hollow eyes. There was no escape, no hope for them now. The woman reached out toward them, her hands stretching out like a skeletal claw, her fingers long and gnarled. As she did, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The floorboards creaked, and the air seemed to warp with an otherworldly pressure. The scream of the woman's mouth was silent, but Sarah could feel it in the pit of her stomach. A deep, vibrating hum, like a cry of anguish that resonated through every cell of her body. It was a scream without sound, a scream that echoed directly into the soul. "Get out of here," the woman cried, but her voice was garbled, distorted by the storm that raged behind her. "The curse will take you all." Her words were a warning, but there was no time to react. Before anyone could move, the woman lunged forward, her hand reaching toward them, her eyes wide with desperation and terror. In that instant, everything seemed to implode, as if the world itself was crumbling around them. The air grew heavy, with an unbearable pressure, the walls of the cabin beginning to buckle under the weight of the woman's presence. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the group was thrown back as though by an unseen force. The entire cabin seemed to shake, the walls groaning as if the house itself was alive, writhing in agony. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, and the air was thick with the sense that they were no longer alone. Then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the house went still. The woman was gone. The storm outside still raged, but the immediate terror that had filled the cabin had faded, leaving only the lingering sense of dread in its wake. For a moment, the group stood frozen in place, too terrified to speak. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But the shadows seemed different now, darker, longer, and far more oppressive. The air felt colder, thicker, as if something had changed in the very fabric of the world around them. "What the hell was that?" Mark gasped, his voice shaking. "We're not safe," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow and distant. She didn't need to explain. They all knew what had just happened. They had seen it with their own eyes. The last thing they heard before everything went dark was the woman's scream. It echoed through the cabin, deafening in its intensity, a sound that carried all the pain of centuries, and with it, the darkness swallowed them whole, leaving behind only the memory of the terror they had experienced, and the nightmare they would never escape.